All right, folks. We're live on Facebook, so no state secrets right now. If you want to bring the conversations about the imminent revolution to an end, that'd be probably a good idea. Just introducing you from afar. Being from the same trade. The busiest woman in the room wants to see it going. It's fair enough. Thanks everyone for coming. Of course, the first thing we want to do is acknowledge that we're meeting in the land of the Gadigal people and pay our respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. My name is not Arma Somaratna, it is Luke Whitington. I think nearly everyone in this room knows me, but for the benefit of our comrades on Facebook Live, I'm Luke Whitington, the Executive Officer of the Search Foundation. Search Foundation, of course, is a non-partisan, non-sectarian socialist organisation that links and enables socialists from all backgrounds in the work that they do across Australia. It's a national organisation. We put on events, we publish things through Search News and through our partnership with Australian Options, and we also participate. We've got a federal election campaign that we participate in through our various working groups. And tonight our event is with Aaron Timms about the recent article he wrote called "This Is Not a Blip," which it says, "This is not a blip. What's wrong with what Liberals say is wrong with the world?" So that's the first question we've got, but I'll do a quick introduction of Aaron, former SMH journalist and now writer for The Baffler, and recently was working for a company as I've forgotten the actual title that you held. But,
the title was irrelevant.
The title was irrelevant?
The job was a joke, but I was a director of research at an artificial intelligence startup in New York that was focused on political risk. And it was not very good.
And you wrote a very interesting article on that for The Baffler,
yep,
which was the first article of yours, long article of yours that I read, and it was fantastic, and that's why I was so interested in This Is Not a Blip, which was a follow-up on, well, not a follow-up, but the next article you wrote. So without further ado, I'll ask, your article, the starting point of our discussion, is titled, "This is not a blip, what's wrong with what Liberals say is wrong with the world?" So what do Liberals get wrong about what's wrong with the world?
Right, so I can sort of explain a little bit the genesis of the article, and I'm assuming that most of the people in the room and those watching, if indeed there are any, have not read the article. So just a bit of background to kind of orient everyone. I had written a review essentially of a book by a guy called Ian Bremmer, who's sort of the political scientist to corporate America, I think is the best way to understand him. He kind of runs a political risk firm, which is pretty influential in the US, which is called Eurasia Group. And so he wrote this book. He's written a bunch of books. He started off as a serious political scientist in the 90s, and then started this firm, and he kind of has turned into this media clown, essentially, who pretends to have very sophisticated views on politics, but often falls short of that description. In fact, always falls short of that description. So he wrote this book, which was sort of supposed to be about what's going on with populism and all that kind of stuff today. And the book was very bad, and so I wrote my review. But one of the things that struck me was that he talks about populism and sort of the populism of the right and the moment that we're living through. Trump, Brexit, all this other stuff. The rise of the reactionary right. He talked about these things and sort of what it fed them, income inequality, all these types of things, the financial crisis, etc., etc. He talked about the causes of this particular moment as if they'd sort of just arisen from nothing, as if they were these kind of cosmic, imminent forces that had sort of evolved out of nothing. And so the description of what had actually led us to this moment was really, really shallow. In fact, it wasn't even there at all. And so and so that sort of got me thinking a little bit. And as I sort of started to consume sort of more stuff throughout last year, I noticed that this was actually a kind of feature that was common to many liberal, sort of diagnoses or descriptions of the populism, of the rise of populism. That kind of the financial crisis and income inequality were just kind of these, self-contained things that just sort of emerged, and they just kind of happened. They were just there. And so there was no deep examination of the causes, essentially, of these things, the causes of the financial crisis, the causes of income inequality, and sort of some of these other big social forces that are behind a lot of the dysfunction that we're experiencing today. And the other thing I noticed was the way that, so I thought, well, isn't that interesting that the discussion of causes is so shallow from these kinds of commentators who are essentially, liberals of one description or another. They're either, self-identify as centrists, or they're Reuben Democrats, as they'd be called in the US, or Rockefeller Republicans. So they're kind of, somewhere in the center. They like markets. They're in favor of public services. They, they basically call themselves liberals. And so the other thing that I noticed as I read a couple of things, there was a piece by a guy, the number 2 at the IMF, a guy called David Lipton. There were, speeches by people like Macron in France, even Obama's sort of first big speech, first big sort of partisan speech after his presidency came to an end, which he delivered in September last year, where he sort of really went after Trump for the first time. I noticed that they all had this in common, that they didn't really talk about the causes too much. They just said, well, income inequality and all these things are here, and this is what has given us Trump, essentially. And there was no sort of attempt to go any deeper than that. And the other thing I noticed, and this is kind of, I'm getting to the point here, and sorry it's taken so long, is, that they kept on, there was this sort of pathology to kind of describe the current moment with the rise of populism, and sort of the, demagogic right, if you like, that it was just this blip, that it was a blip. That it was an aberration, that it was a parenthesis. Hello, how are you, Aaron Conway? And so we're just doing the first question. No, it's okay.
I asked it.
Right. And so, so in other words, well, this moment really sucks. Trump is a terrible person. We can all agree on that. Brexit happened. It was bad. Right-wing populists, racists, we don't like any of that stuff. But, it's just a thing that we're going through. It's a moment, it's a parenthesis. This is sort of the language that these people use to describe this particular sort of dysfunction that we're living through right now. So in other words, they would say it's a moment, it's a blip, it's an aberration, it's a parenthesis. And so what we really need to do is get back to what came before we got into this blip. In other words, we need to go back to the status quo that was controlled by liberals and centrists, and it was very market friendly and business friendly and all that kind of stuff. And that to me seemed like, and the kind of rhetorical tricks that liberals employ, liberals and centrists employ to kind of cement this argument. They sort of say, well, this is not normal. This is extraordinary. This is, uncivil. It's uncivilized, and so they kind of set themselves up. Liberals set themselves up as the guardians and the administrators of what is normal and sane and healthy and natural. So they kind of basically present the argument that the only way that we can get out of this particular moment, the only way that we can get beyond the populism of the right is essentially to sort of invigorate the global rules-based liberal order. And so that to me just seems, a completely ridiculous argument. And it's ridiculous chiefly because liberals fail to acknowledge that the reasons that we got into this situation in the first place are precisely because of liberalism precisely because of the abdication of the public sector to private interests, and so on and so forth. So linking the two things together, they would say, well, this is a parenthesis of liberalism, and at the same time they would fail to acknowledge that it's actually the product of liberalism, that it's not, that it's not sort of an exception. It's actually sort of the thing. Liberalism is the thing that got us to this moment, and so that's the sort of the whole argument of the piece, is to say, well, we should not accept this at a rhetorical level. We really have to fight very hard against this idea that this is just sort of just a one-off, and it's a passing moment, and that what is natural and right is that we go back to what came beforehand. So that's the basic thing that I think liberals get wrong. And so I started to think a bit more about well, what would, if we were to kind of tell the story of what brought us to this moment, what would a more sort of accurate, a more honest, a more intelligent sort of reckoning with the causes of populism and the causes of the rise of the right look like? And so I kind of sketched out my own sort of very sort of general version of what I think that would look like, and that's sort of the second part of the piece. And I mean, we can get into that a little bit more, but it's really all about this policy decisions that were made in the 1970s and 1980s to deal with distributional conflict. And I should say, before I go on, I'm mostly, because I live in the US, I wrote this for a US publication. It really is, anchored in the reality of the American experience and sort of American history. But obviously we're all affected by that in this country as well. So I went back and sort of looked at what happened in the 1970s and 80s to solve sort of the distributional conflicts that came about as a result of the inflation crisis, principally, but also the energy crisis and sort of problems with growth in the 70s. And I tried to show, and this isn't an original argument because I sort of drew on the work of lots of other people, that it really was this idea of kind of just letting the market decide about distributional conflict that led us to this point, that really kind of unlocked financialization, that led to this massive expansion in credit, and these are the forces that kind of led to the absurd financialization of the economy that sort of created the conditions for the financial crisis and so on and so forth. So that's sort of very broadly speaking what the piece is about. And yeah, sorry for talking so long.
Plenty more talking to do.
Yeah.
Sorry everyone for being late, by the way. The several crows is deceptively short distance. So look, the next question is the time for the first one. This blip thinking is dangerous, like you said. Who are these blip thinkers, and how would you summarize their worldview? Right.
So yeah, I think I sort of covered a bit of that. I mean, the blip thinkers are essentially liberals, centrists. Like I say, people who want to find market solutions to public problems and are happy to sort of let the market decide. I think that's the thing that probably defines them more than anything else in terms of what they actually do, rather than sort of giving them just another label like liberal or rooted Democrat or Rockefeller Republican. It's, we need to sort of allow the market, we need to give the market room to do its thing. That, the market is the thing that's going to be able to innovate its way out of all the problems that we face. So the best thing that the public sector can do, the best thing that government can do, is just sort of get out of the way and let private enterprise do its thing. So that's sort of, I think, the most important aspect of blip thinking, but it's all rolled up with the rest of liberalism, sort of the institutions that go with it, and so forth. So it's that, but it's also, I think it's also kind of the argument. It kind of goes back a little bit to neoliberalism. I mean, I'm always a little bit wary about using these words because they mean different things to different people. But in fact, I don't know if you're following this on Twitter, but there's this whole move now to rehabilitate the word neoliberal and basically reclaim it. It's obviously a term of abuse mostly. I mean, I don't know how you use it. So in other words, to take it, it's basically left liberal economists, sort of left-leaning economists, trying to take this word and rehabilitate it and turn it into something nice. So it all gets very confusing because I don't know which neoliberal people are referring to at any one moment. But I mean, the basic point was, by kind of letting the market do its thing, we're going to get strong growth. We're going to get strong economic growth. We're going to get strong growth in wages. And yeah, we might have to deal with some inequality into the bargain, but that's going to be okay because everyone's going to be better off because the economy is going to grow and wages are going to grow. And of course, neither of those things have happened. So, and we're sort of living with the likelihood that they're not going to improve anytime soon. So that basic sort of secular stagnation thesis. So they're the Blip thinkers, the people who think that just let the market do its thing and everything will be okay. But it's all sort of bound up with kind of cultural notions of how to behave in the public sphere and to play by the rules and to be civil and to not say nasty things about your opponents and all that kind of stuff, and to kind of have a sort of dignity about public discourse. You can obviously have all those things and not be a Blip thinker, but often in the way that sort of Blip thinkers present their ideas to the public, I think the aesthetics often blur with the substance. It's impossible to have the content without the form, if you like. So anyway.
Awesome. I definitely used to work in a liberalism myself. So you use the term global entropy that brings together linked and related, but often politically separated problems of climate collapse and economic inequality and stagnation. So that's a powerful term that you coined. It evokes images of like civilizational and biological decay, and it captures the mood, particularly among young people, and that the world has peaked and it is on a downhill run. Is this how you feel, and is there much hope for us then?
Yeah.
Very gloomy
Right.
No pressure though.
Right. No, I do. Like, I feel on our current trajectory, that's sort of what we're going to get. We're not going to solve these problems. I mean, you can even see a little bit of that. I mean, this piece came out in sort of October, November last year. Things have obviously changed in the US since then. The Democrats have retaken the House, and you've got a lot of energy behind AOC and so forth, the Green New Deal, this kind of stuff. But you can already see, I mean, even if you've been following the actual sort of changes to the Google Doc that the Green New Deal is in, there are things that have been taken out. There's a sort of watering down of the ambition of the vision, and that it's going to get pulled into the horse trading and the compromises and the bargaining that are necessarily involved in representative politics. So big ideas like that are sort of what we need. But I'm not sure that, so to answer your question, global entropy is sort of what we're in for at this point. The UN sort of climate change panel came out with it in October that said, we've only got 10 or 12 years to solve this thing. So that's not too encouraging. And the whole sort of problem of income inequality is not likely to be solved in our current trajectory. I mean, there's no asset prices, assets continue to appreciate in value, wages are stagnant, so that basic dynamic is unchanged and unchanging for the foreseeable future. So in that sense, yes, it's very sort of, it's very gloomy, it's very discouraging, it's depressing. But at the same time, there's always hope, and I think that a lot of hope, this is a question of kind of, well, what do we do about things, which is a very fair question to ask, and I obviously don't have the answer. But I think one thing that might be useful is to think more about how these debates are framed, which was kind of what the whole point of this piece was, talking about trying to attack the idea that liberals put forward that this is just a parenthesis and we just have to sort of ride it out and beat Trump or beat the bad guys at the next election, and that's kind of all that matters. I think that's really short-sighted. So we really need to go after sort of market-friendly centrists and liberals on that basis. We really need to hold them to account and say, no, we need to, that is incorrect, and we need to reckon much more carefully with the history of what brought us here. So I think that's really, really important. I mean, on the sort of same kind of in the same sort of mode, I guess. There's a recent book by the leftist economist, I guess you'd call her, Mariana Mazzucato, where it's called The Value of Everything, where she talked about essentially set out a rhetorical strategy. It's like a marketing strategy, a PR strategy, to kind of take down the bad guys. And so her argument was, well, we talk about price all the time, and we value everything in terms of what its price is, but we should talk more about value, and we should understand that governments create a lot of markets, and governments create value, and that often the benefits of that sort of process are privatized while the risks are socialized, and we need to sort of recalibrate the way that we talk about it so that we can kind of bring people along with the reforms that we want to enact. So I think that's, I sort of bring that up because I think it's kind of similar. Instead of talking about what is the price of this, we should be talking about what is the value of it. And the approach that I'm suggesting, which is to sort of think much more carefully about the words that are used, and to attack liberals on the basis of the words that they use, is sort of part of that. Of course, there is hope in terms of substantive policy as well, and that's a separate discussion, I guess.
Just if I could intervene, the Mazzucato book, actually I've read, and I think it's pretty powerful in a lot of ways. It's a good historical piece there. The way she presents it, though, is it seems like that. It's a rhetorical issue.
Yeah.
She describes herself at one in the interview as being almost a life coach to the public service,
right? Right.
And saying it in those terms when it doesn't really sort of get at
Policy.
at policy or a deeper level in terms of the structural issues. So that's my misgivings, at any rate, with which was otherwise a very promising book.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a great book, but I think the rhetorical component of it is what I took from it. That, and that seems to be the most sort of fully considered part of the book.
Yes.
The ideas for reform, which essentially came down to financial transaction taxes, the sort of Pigovian taxes, things like that, they've all been made before. And her whole argument, which sort of builds on the argument that she made in the Innovative State, or whatever her book from 2013 was called, was all about saying, well, how does innovation happen? We have this notion that's fed by the media and the tech sector, that there were just, one day there was this random genius called Mark Zuckerberg, and he came up with this thing, and it's incredible, and it's like a sort of Silicon Valley's version of great man theory, right? And so her whole argument was, well, of course, Mark Zuckerberg is only able to do that because of the internet. The internet only exists because of DARPANET. DARPANET only exists because of massive US government investment in technology in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And yes, it was kind of tied to a nefarious sort of military project, but that's the kind of thing that she wants to correct. She sort of says, yes, let's get into the substance, but first let's actually have a reckoning with history and sort of say, well, when Facebook takes all the profits, Mark Zuckerberg takes all the profits of Facebook for himself, that doesn't recognize the fact that his whole invention rests on this bedrock of government investment, and the value of his product accrues to him and Facebook shareholders, but none of it accrues to the public sector or sort of the public sphere, which basically funded the whole thing that gave Facebook its reason for being in the first place. So I think that's a very powerful argument, and she makes it again in The Value of Everything, and so so in that sense, I think there's something to be gained from that, and I don't think she's wrong to insist on the importance of messaging.
Yeah, but just something, I'll be brief anyway. I think you have to go further than pointing out stories. Wi-Fi popped out of CSIRO and things like that,
right?
To deal with the issues.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah, I agree.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so you say in a piece that failures of liberalism and neoliberalism cannot be addressed by yet more liberalism. Could you give us an example of that in the US or Europe?
You know, I think it's sort of like the response to the financial crisis is probably a good the first example that sort of pops into my head. I mean, this idea that, you know, we don't have to change anything about the incentives of these firms, these large financial firms, at a really deep level. We can just kind of regulate our way out of these problems and, you know, adjust the capital ratios here and do some swaps reform there, have the Volcker rule that gets rid of proprietary trading. It doesn't really, I don't think that sort of, you know, that's a sort of reformist, a liberal reformist response. And, you know, there are two problems with it. First, it always gets, you know, those types of responses always get watered down in the natural sort of process of compromise that accompanies the enactment of any type of legislation. You know, and most importantly, I don't think it really, you know, gets at what drove financial institutions to get us into that situation in the first place. And I mean, it's a much more complex discussion to talk about, you know, what the causes were, but it was some combination of, you know, the expansion of credit through the 80s and 90s, financial deregulation, you know, the repeal of Glass-Steagall in the late 90s, and, you know, just the massive sort of need that every firm feels to keep growing. I think that's the most important thing. And, you know, the Liberals' responses don't really get at that. And so so we're now in a situation where people have stopped thinking, you know, for the most part at least, in sort of very obvious corners of the public domain about the dangers posed by financial institutions. It's like, well, we kind of fixed that and we don't have to worry about it anymore. But I'm not sure that we can be so confident about that. So yeah, I don't know if that's the best example, but that's kind of one example. But I mean, it really comes down to the fact that, you know, you don't address these sort of deep sort of structural determinants of the crisis that we're going that we're going through. Sorry.
You had a question?
Yes, thank you, Aaron. I'm going to warn you that my question might be a little bit annoying because I'm going to ask a question and propose an answer and see if you agree with it.
No, I like that.
Thanks. So yeah, the question, I guess, is one of the assumptions of the way you frame this discourse of the blip is one of the assumptions behind it is that there is a group of liberals who use this discourse to reinforce a particular kind of institutional power. Mm-hmm. That they use to continue to drive neoliberalism forward. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you think that ascribing this certain discursive power to such people really gets at the materialist roots of where neoliberalism comes from and so on, or if it just reinforces the idealist view of the world. So I guess the response that I would have to that question is that in many ways the way you describe liberals in this sense reminds me of reactionaries when they say make America great again. Mm-hmm. And I've been reading a bit of Frantz Fanon recently, the Marxist from Martinique, who's very influential during the Algerian Revolution. And he lays out two totalities in which I guess a kind of conflict, a class conflict, is suppressed, in which certain people are prevented from seeing how they are oppressed and therefore fighting against that oppression. Right. And that's firstly the reactionary latitudinal conflict, right, which draws out sort of expansive worldview in which there is a sort of a singular kind of hegemon assigned to, you know, the nation or the race that must be prioritized over everything else. But then there's also the longitudinal totality, which sees pretty much the same totality but stretched across history, so it's a way increasingly progressing towards a perfectly worked out society. Right. And he seems to correspond with the assumption behind your article, right? In that there's this ideology of progress in which such events must be understood as merely a blip.
Right.
And if that's the case, then the biggest consequence of this ideology is that it obscures perhaps other blips, other, exceptional circumstances which represent the constant suffering of people under this ideology of progress that remain unacknowledged, and these people are left out of the account of history, and therefore it prevents them from participating in struggle. And well, what do you think of that?
I like it. Yeah, good answer. I'd like to endorse it. So I think this whole sort of the progress argument is interesting, and that's that's an unchallenged part of to get at your point about sort of the material sort of conditions as opposed to just a rhetorical strategy. That's definitely one unchallenged part of it. But I mean, I'm sort of reminded of something I made sure to sort of keep a note of this so that I could read it out. And so I'm going to read out a quote from an economist, a political economist. Where do we find the deepest poverty, the hardest struggle for existence, the greatest enforced idleness? Why, wherever material progress is most advanced? This relation of progress to poverty is the great question of our time. So that was written in 1879 by Henry George in Progress and Poverty. And it's still true today, I think. So this kind of very sort of the Whig view of history that where everything's getting better and things are only going to get better and better is obviously very problematic in that way. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question properly, but
yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Any other questions?
When I'm saying here, when I started reading your articles, it started off with the Colorado River and droughts and acidification. And that was just when the Murray-Darling disaster was opening up here. Are you a bit familiar with
Oh,
that? Yeah. There must be lots of parallels, not just rivers and water, but I thought your article was going to be mainly about climate.
Yeah.
And it sort of is, that link between the politics, economics, economic power,
right,
and what's happening with climate. And just back to we were talking before about what, the walkers are going to get out of it.
Right.
10 years, 12 years, whatever. And the question, if that is true, if the science is real, if you take it as reality, then what? Then you have to think about that there will be a whole range of different aspects of collapse, just to give it one word.
Right.
But it'll be different here and there, and some places have already collapsed.
Yeah.
So the question is what to do in that very nasty situation that we have found ourselves. Unprecedented, all sorts of things you could say about it being hard to think about.
Right.
But we're forced to either party on or do something.
Yeah.
Try and do something. So
have
you been able to think about those sorts of... No one knows the answer. Right. I think we have to start addressing.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And so that's the one thing you can point to that might sort of force a kind of a more considered and urgent approach to this type of stuff. But you have the problem of convincing people that it's real and so on and so forth.
Well,
so,
heaps more disasters
Oh yeah, no. I mean, it would be nice to think that we don't have to get to the point where we're carrying under the table from bushfire on Sussex Street or whatever. Not that's a terrible example, but that it's not going to get so bad and so sort of the planet is going to become so unlivable that we'll have no other option. That it will be so abundantly obvious to people that we need to do something about it. But it seems to be heading in that direction. So But I mean,
Look, I understand, that's why I'm asking the question here. I'm hoping that a group of people we could start to, I mean, there are other people writing about this.
Yeah.
Deep adaptation.
Right.
Come across that. It's a UK sort of process, or you know, and a lot of it links to things. I think in the US, eco-socialists are talking about green co-ops. You know, sort of you know, the whole you know, no business as usual. Everything is up in the air. It will either be destroyed or you'll be able to manage some of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so one thing which I kind of sort of mentioned very briefly in this piece, but I think is interesting, is the whole idea of whether we can get out of this position through rational argumentation, or whether it's going to be something more spontaneous and passionate. And you know, because it does feel like already when you observe what's going on in the US and the way that, you know, the conservatives are gearing up to have an argument about the definition of the word socialism. Essentially, that's sort of, they've already foreshadowed what their strategy for the 2020 election is. And there's so many of the old kind of cliches, essentially, of political combat live on. I mean, they just refuse to die. You hear them all the time. You know, government shouldn't pick winners and all this kind of stuff. I mean, you know, government should get out of the way, or, you know, let the market decide and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's you know, it's difficult to think how you can reason with that. You know, I mean, you can present the evidence, but there is, you know, there is a core of the world that just doesn't want to be confronted with evidence, and just sort of wants to live in this bizarre parallel, you know, faith-based universe that's sort of.
People say it's got to do with the Western whatever idea that there's nature is out there and we are here, and there's a big divide, and nature is there for us, and and it's that sort of level of ideology.
Yeah, and arrogance. Yeah.
Lee, you had a question?
Thanks very much, Aaron. It's really interesting and useful, particularly coming to the election and the state of the world. You made reference on stage about representative democracy.
Yeah.
And I might have misunderstood, so therefore my question might be skewed, but just to ask you, I think you were making it in the context of wondering if representative democracy can handle the, you know, how do we respond to the situation. Was that what you were saying, and have you got views on what it should be?
Well, yeah. So I think I was just saying, you know, making the very obvious point that idealism necessarily becomes compromised through the political process. I mean, not necessarily, but often does. But yeah. So to this whole question of whether you can solve these problems through democracy, I mean, there's a basic tension, to go back to this point about the 1970s and the problems of the 1970s. I really do think we're, you know, living through these problems again, or we just haven't solved them. We essentially deferred making a decision about them indefinitely, and that's why we got into the situation that we're in today. But the whole point of that was, well, you know, the sort of the countries of the developed world were deindustrializing. There was, you know, inflation. People were, you know, upset. You know, the population was making all sorts of different segments of the population were making all sorts of claims on public wealth, if you like. And so there was this question, this very real question, which persists today, that governments faced about how to distribute wealth between competing actors. And the answer that governments came up with, the US government came up with in the 1970s, was essentially to let the market decide. So this is why you've got this thing called the Regulation Q, which removed ceilings on savings deposits, removed interest rate ceilings on savings deposits. So all of a sudden, you've got this massive expansion in credit. At the same time, you had, you know, the Volcker shock, which led to this massive spike in interest rates. And you had all this money from overseas, you know, because assets want to go wherever they find the highest yield. All this money from overseas rushed into the US. And so you got this kind of bubble, which is a sort of bubble that continues today. I mean, we've had sort of sort of pauses, if you like, along the way, like the 87 crash and the dot-com bubble and then the financial crisis. But, you know, it's assets continue to appreciate in value, and that's sort of, like I said before, and we all know this, that's sort of the fundamental, one of the two fundamental drivers of inequality. But the whole, so to come back to your question about democracy, the whole point of this was, yeah, this is what the neoliberal project is about. And there's a book by a guy called Quinn Slobodian about sort of, that goes into this history of neoliberalism. It's really, really good book, and you know, if you want to read up more about that, then I'm sure many of you have already read the book. But if you haven't, you should go out and check it out, because it's really good. So his whole point is, well, you know, the sort of Montpellerin society kind of you know, had this idea that democracy was a problem that had to be contained, and that, you know, if markets were going to be able to do their thing, we had to kind of keep democracy, had to keep the demos down. It's a problem. And so that's the whole neoliberal project, and that's essentially what led to this these policy actions in the 1970s. They essentially said, well, you know, we can't decide, we don't know how to distribute all this sort of wealth between these competing actors, because now we're in a situation of scarcity. So, you know, let the market decide. And they were very clear about that. You know, Paul Volcker said, you know, that, I mean, I'm not sure that he said this, but he, you know, the whole premise of the Volcker shock was that if you wanted to fix inflation, the necessary price that you had to pay was unemployment. So you got unemployment and you just wouldn't worry about it, right? Just let it happen, because the thing that you really wanted to do was tame inflation. So I think what we're seeing now is the basic sort of, the revelation of this basic incompatibility, or this basic tension, I should say, between markets and democracy in liberalism. You know, liberalism of all descriptions, whether it's neoliberalism or classic liberalism. And so I think, you know, to finally get to your question, I think that, you know, the answer to that is not to sort of turn away from democracy. It's to, you know, recommit to democracy, to have more democracy, to sort of reinvest in the public sphere, and to understand that all of these questions of economic justice are fundamentally political, that economic policy is political. So in other words, it's to you know, reinvigorate the discipline of political economy, and to not sort of leave it to the technocrats, because what we've experienced, and we're still experiencing, is that to, you know, get good policy, the politics is just as important as the economics. And so, yeah, so I do think more democracy is the answer. Now, I know that's a really vague thing to say, but I mean, some of the, you know, propositions that are, some of the proposals, I'll give you an example. So there's a book I read recently which sort of has generated a lot of interest in kind of radical liberal and libertarian circles, let's say. But I mean, a bunch of these people who are into this new definition of neoliberal on the internet are really into it. So it's a book called Radical Markets, and it's by a guy called Richard Posner, who's a law professor, and Glenn Weil, who's kind of a, you know, a thinkfluencer. Is probably the best way to describe him. But, you know, I mean, he's a smart guy and all that kind of stuff. So Radical Markets, and their whole idea is, you know, yes, we have these failures. You know, we all see the problems that are before us. The answer is not to, you know, introduce a wealth tax or a Green New Deal or any of the stuff that's being proposed on the left. It's to reinvest in markets. Markets are the solution. The problem is that markets and democracy have always been in tension, and for 40 years we sort of gave the initiative to markets, but we didn't do it enough. That there was still too much democracy, and the intrusion of democracy into the marketization of society was what accounted for the ultimate failure of that marketization. So let's reinvest in markets. You know, markets for everything. Markets for, you know, housing. They've got this whole idea, which is based on the ideas of Henry George, about kind of land taxes and making every property sort of available for auction every year. It's kind of complicated and a bit weird. But markets for democracy, so you get voting credits and you can vote in single issue referendums. There are no sort of general elections anymore. You vote in single issue referendums based on how much you care about them. So you use all your credits in one go if you really care about that particular issue, and you forget about the rest of the referendums they're having. So just marketize everything. And that's all, it's actually a really interesting book if you want to know how the thinking on this kind of stuff is evolving in the kind of liberal libertarian-ish sphere. But it obviously cements, to me at least, cements a lot of the inequalities that we're living through today. And there's obviously questions about who benefits in that kind of society. It's obviously the people who already have wealth, who already have assets, and it's not really going to solve anything. So I'm sort of at the opposite end of that spectrum, which is that you need to kind of democratize things way more, and there needs to be way more public contestation about these big issues. But I mean, it really does come down to this contest between markets and democracy, which is what liberalism was all about. Basically, suppress democracy and let the markets do their thing. I think we need to flip that and sort of suppress markets and let democracy do its thing.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I'm just going, if I could take up you talk about the rhetorical flourishes, that tactics that are used by the Blips. And one of them, I think, is that they play with values in a very, very abstract way, and they say, well, look, all of this stuff can be solved in some sense by institutions that ultimately are housed under liberal capitalism. Right. We just don't have the confidence, I don't think, in the public sector institutions that we have grown accustomed to and developed, since the Second World War at least. And that what we need to do is actually think creatively about just how services are funded and delivered. Right. In a way that give us confidence that say, well, no, we don't need the market. We can do it this way. Right. And any thoughts?
Yeah.
Because I think that's exactly what you're driving at.
Yeah. So a reinvigorated state essentially. It's to come back to Mazzucato. I mean, I don't know if you've read her stuff about missions, but I mean, again, it's an extension of the idea from the entrepreneurial state, which is that, so much of this conversation about, public and private turns into these very sort of horrible public-private partnership thingies that ultimately, are very unsatisfactory. Her idea is we need to think more about the state as a creator of markets. So you can have all sorts of, you can have whatever opinion you want about markets. Like some people say, well, all markets are terrible. Other people might want to, who are on the left or sort of on this end of the left, might want to use specific purpose markets, in a very limited kind of way. But her argument is the state. There's a real role for the state in basically saying, here are the big sort of 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 or whatever missions, big challenges that we face, and here are the things that we need to do to meet these challenges. So whether it's climate change or sort of curing, finding a cure for some disease or sort of big public health initiative like that. And so her idea is, well, the state should be in charge of kind of establishing a market for that and for sort of bringing in lots of different actors from lots of different sectors and creating the conditions for innovation to happen. And all the sort of wealth that's created through that process should be, socialized. So, that's one way, that's one sort of idea that I've seen that I think is probably, it's worth trying. I think the best thing you can say about all the, when people sort of put forward concrete proposals in this kind of context where things are getting pretty desperate and we've got 10 years to sort things out, is, we have to give stuff a go. Like, I mean, you can't, you just got to get into it, kind of thing.
I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts
on one of the most remarkable things about that last US presidential election was that Trump was appealing, part of his appeal was to ordinary workers who've been screwed by global trade deals, and he denounced the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I mean, do you think this is significant, or was that just a sort of trivial little joust that he put together with other things in order to win? I mean, I ask that because other parts of the sort of elite, the real elite, the corporate elite, are talking about problems with neoliberalism. Right. It's not just us lefties in a room in Sydney. The IMF is publishing research that says, well, it's creating inequality, and inequality is creating problems for us. But my question really is about why Trump used that kind of appeal, the sort of appeal that, in the sense we share, that if you don't look after people's jobs and if you don't have some protection of an economy, you'll just get whole industrial wastelands.
Right.
And other things flowing from that, not just poverty and so on.
Yeah, you probably won't be surprised to hear that I don't have any special insight into Donald Trump's brain, and I'm not sure that he has that insight either. But I think, you know, it was definitely cynical and probably just something he thought of at the time, and it felt like a good kind of populist argument. But yeah, it was clearly something that resonated as well. And it is something, like you say, that is being discussed and debated seriously in liberal institutions like the IMF. But I'm not sure that you get you can arrive at a really durable and satisfactory solution to these types of problems through institutions like the IMF. I think you're going to get a kind of, you know, watered down, technocratic sort of answer, and that's.
I wasn't supporting that.
Yeah, no, I know, but you know, so I don't think, I think it's kind of a distraction to think too much about, you know, the ideas that they're putting forward, because they don't, you know, they're not going to address the deep sort of structural determinants.
I'm not looking to them for some sort of solution.
Yeah.
I just think when you do an analysis of a situation, you look for what's changing, what's new, where there's movement. And there's movement starting to happen. One of the weird things is Trump making this appeal against free trade. That's not the language of the Republican Party. It hasn't been for many decades.
So yeah, I mean,
so there's something strange happening in the world.
Trump does not speak the language of the Republican Party in any of his sentences. So I don't think it's all that remarkable. But yeah, he sort of. Yeah, he's always essentially been a kind of isolationist, I guess, if you want to ascribe any kind of ideological consistency to him, which you probably shouldn't. You know, he's always been against, you know, foreign policy adventures and yeah, so his appeal to the workers didn't strike me at the time as particularly incongruous or out of character.
I'm not saying it was his main reason he won. I think it's significant.
Yeah, oh no, it's definitely significant, and. He plugged in, yeah, right, but he plugged into all the discontent that's associated with the things that, you know, that we've been talking about. And what has he done to address these problems? Absolutely nothing. You know, in fact, he's gone in completely the opposite direction. Yeah, he's sort of, you know, had a few kind of high stakes, but you know, only in his own mind, tussles with different governments about trade deals and so forth. But you know, the really durable policy achievements, if you can call them that, of his administration are to, you know, create a better tax situation for the wealthy and to repeal some financial regulations and to, you know, demonize brown people. I mean, that's basically it. Yeah.
Yeah, Richard?
Could you just tell us your opinion of two people in US politics at the moment? One's Bernie Sanders and the other's Elizabeth Warren, who describes herself as, I'm a capitalist, even though a lot of people think that she's, you know, quite progressive, and she is on a lot of issues.
Right.
So, but Bernie Sanders has a clear, it seems to me, class message.
Right.
About what he says. He calls out the billionaires and the
Yes.
millionaires. She sort of says, yeah, they're bad, but, you know, and we've got to regulate them and so on. But what's your analysis of them?
It's very similar to yours, which is that, yeah, I think Bernie's very consistent in his message and has been for about 4 decades or whatever it was, since he began, since he was first running in Vermont in the 70s. Yeah, so you get a sort of the classic kind of progressive reformist response from Elizabeth Warren, which is what makes me think that she's ultimately the candidate who's probably going to appeal to most of the Democratic Party. Because she kind of feels like the candidate that everyone can live with. But yeah, but Bernie's message is very strong. He's now diversifying as well into foreign policy and sort of personal narratives of uplift and things like that, which is what he did at his launch in Brooklyn a couple of days ago. So they're all pretty encouraging signs. I mean, all the policy energy in the party and on the fringes of it, in sort of all the organisations that are going to eventually throw their lot behind the Democratic nominee, is obviously with Bernie and with the sort of the whatever you want to call it, the DSA left. So that's interesting. It's just a yeah. So my support is with him, but yeah, I'm just not sure how strong the kind of establishment opposition, the structural opposition to him is going to be. I sense things will be slightly different this time, but yeah, I just don't know.
Anyone else?
I did have one last question. I think we've got just about enough time, a couple more minutes to go. There you go.
Yeah, is it
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Look, I want to know what do you think liberalism's response to climate change is? And as leftists, how do we actually respond to that and have this to sort of policy that address climate change, given that we've got a maximum of 12 years ago?
Yeah.
So, liberalism is insidious. I think that's have a messaging, like I said.
Yeah, right. So I think it will be it will probably look a little bit like, I'm trying to think of if there's a historical antecedent. It will probably look a little bit like something like the Obama sort of renewable energy drive, which everyone remembers only because of Solyndra. So everyone remembers the failure. And so I think it'll probably end up looking something like that, where there is a government fund that invests in renewable energy firms, but it's ultimately up to the private sector to really lead the innovation. And they'll probably even go, if you think of if liberals were in power, how would they do it? They would probably be really kind of hyper sort of neurotic about the Solyndra thing, because it was such a big deal in the US at the time, and the Conservatives made such a big deal out of it, even though it was one firm in a fund that was providing capital to lots of different firms. It turned into this sort of never-ending controversy for the Obama administration in its first term, and so they probably work to make it a little more market-friendly in some ways. That's sort of how I imagine they would do it. And what should the response be? I think probably something along the lines of what we were talking about before, with sort of the Mariana Mazzucato thing. I'm not sure that that's the best solution, but short of proposing something better myself, which I haven't done, and I'm unfortunately not able to do on the fly right now. I think that's pretty good. Where we say the state, the public domain, the public sphere really sort of sets the terms of this market and makes all the kind of dividend and sort of thoroughly debates all the difficult decisions about how to set the parameters and all that kind of stuff, and then you can have sort of some sort of participation from firms involved in that. I really don't know though. Yeah.
Next piece.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we're pretty much wrapped up. No,
I want to answer it.
Well, we should. It was actually in relation to the very last part of your article, where you referred to the Finnish researchers who said,
Oh,
if
yeah.
unchanged, then capitalism will kill the earth,
Right.
which came out in August, and is linked in your article. And then there's a line they've got in there, which is that no economic, program, or I just have it in front of me. Nothing in the knapsack, is there that we can use, we can deal with the forthcoming situation.
Yeah.
And of course, probably some people in this room, and either now or previously, have thought that no, we do have an economic program that can deal with this problem, or at least some of the problems of the world.
Right.
So that's a quite a bold claim on their part, because there are some people out there who are very, very sure of what we should be doing and how we should be doing it, from a left perspective.
Right.
I'm probably a little bit more on your, less certain about some of those, things. But there is, for example, in Australia, between the Labor Party and the Greens, probably a fairly strong social democratic kind of answer to some of those problems.
Right.
And then with Bernie Sanders and AOC, there is also a social democratic sort of project that they think can turn this around.
Yeah.
But the stuff that Sam and I and others have been talking about, and you refer to in terms of global entropy,
Right.
it could all be, it's not enough.
Yeah.
It's a,
it's a palliative.
Yeah.
It's kind of managing the decline kind of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure that and I think so much of the discussion, even in sort of based on the things that we already know about and think will work, does still kind of come back to these old binaries, which is kind of the point that I was making originally, that you've got the individual and the state, and they have to be in conflict with each other, and these kinds of conversations I think are pretty unproductive, and a lot of the kind of whether you call them socialist, sort of some traditional socialist solutions, do kind of still key into those binaries, and so that's why I think it's something worth examining. I'm not saying it's like problematic, it's obviously better than what we have right now, but I'm not sure that it really addresses the problems at a deep level. Like when you think about, firms and how firms operate, and the incentives to growth and things like that, I don't know, it gets complicated for me at least. Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good place to end then.
Yeah.
And if everyone would, thanks, Aaron. You haven't given up your time, and it's nice to thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Arm, as well.
Narrate your life experience.
Yeah.
How about our friends overseas?
Which ones? Those ones?
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I